はピンクの私が悪党をやっつける正義の変身ヒロイン？日本の常識ってやつ？
You don't need to take notes, Sora.
With us having recently finished the series, God, I gotta get organized, I have to admit, I did feel a little sad to see it all end. I mean, not only was it just fun to look back at one of the first fansub anime I ever watched from beginning to end, but the PPG in general have gone pretty radio silent after, well, that, which yes, we'll bring up a little more later. And of course, even if it is brought up, this anime is almost never talked about.
Which, in a way, I get.
Ultimately, this little toy animation that was more made to capitalize on the surprising popularity of the original series was probably never going to be anything more than a footnote in the grand scheme of the franchise. Hell, it was more meant to be like a last-minute replacement after the original 6 seasons had wrapped up on Cartoon Network Japan. And when it did get an English dub, from what I could tell, it was a bit of a slapdash dub and only seemed to air in the Philippines and Australia. Bit of a pity, as I usually like Ocean Production stuff.
The point is that this show objectively didn't leave that much of an imprint on pop culture like its source material, but I would argue it did leave a significant impact on a certain other franchise that's a little more important to this channel.
The series originally ran from July of 2006 to the end of June of 2007. In terms of the Precure franchise, that meant it went from about episode 21 of Splash Star to 21 of Yes 5. And in many ways, you could consider that 1 year to be a part of the big transitional period for the still ongoing Magical Girl franchise. After all, as we said in the second part of the Futari review, it wasn't even supposed to be a franchise, and yet toy sales and ratings said otherwise, resulting in some awkward early years, as they were playing by the seat of their pants for the most part. A lot of people will argue over whether it was Splash Star or Yes 5 where they actually found their legs. Whichever side of the argument you take, it does ultimately mean that at the very least, the franchise at least started to find its own identity in the latter half of Splash Star, just as this show was airing.
Coincidence? I think not!
I mean, just looking at the staff and writing of the show, there's a lot of parallels that you could glean from some of the more recent series. Thus, for this overview, we just want to take some time to appreciate both some of the aspects that fans of the source material are kind of missing out on, as well as its own contributions to the Precure franchise.
With that, one last time, let's sort out all of our thoughts in regards to Powerpuff Girls Z and see what sort of legacy it left behind.
For fans of the source material, this anime certainly had a lot of callbacks, and yet I wouldn't say any of it was to a distracting degree. This was probably best exemplified with this show's villains. Obviously, many of the antagonists were based off of the most notable members of the OG's Rogues Gallery, and some of them were fairly close to their source material, like Fuzzy Lumpkins and the Gangrene Gang. Though in the case of the latter, while the personalities and designs were similar, they did add an interesting layer by giving each member of the gang families, each of which represent different problematic elements of the Japanese familiar hierarchy. Now, giving these characters families was never something they really needed, but it did provide an interesting new spin on them.
Thus, while it is easy to say that this show was just a PPG but Japanified, which was actually part of the original plans for it, I would say it's a little more complicated than that.
They tried to bring their own sensibilities to the table while still paying tribute to the originals. For instance, him was already a bit of an effeminate devil-esque villain, so why not basically turn him into one of Japan's most popular effeminate baddies, down to even having the same VA? Seriously, even when he's not playing Frieza, Ryusei Nakao is always playing the oh-ho-hoing flamboyant villain.
お前の寿命もあと30分で
But yeah, even though they made him into a bit of an XP of one of their own characters, it was clear that Toei Animation knew what sort of character they were dealing with, and even had given him powers not too dissimilar from his original, with one of the more interesting additions to this version of the show, the Black Light.
Yeah, looking back on it, the twist of the black lights coming from him actually makes a lot of sense, especially when you consider what his OG counterpart did.
He could turn anyone or anything into his malicious puppet by infusing them with a little of his essence, which, okay, saying it like that is kind of wrong, and it is. Not to mention, his powers could increase if his victims were in rare states of despair and depression. This show basically took those concepts and expanded them into the main plot of this show, which is kind of brilliant. It turned him into the big bad of the series, which he kind of sort of felt like at times in the OG, and in turn maintained the spirit of the Crab Devil. Not to mention, the Blacklights opened the door for some more original villains beyond just the OG Rogues Gallery. We will get to them in just a bit, but for now, let's actually talk about those OG baddies. Most notably, let's just take a minute to appreciate the two villainesses who got the biggest makeovers for this show. As we mentioned, the Blacklights usually targeted victims that had some sort of underlying despair and or depression. Now, in the case of the original Princess and Sedusa, there wouldn't have been that much to latch onto, other than maybe the latter after she lost her hair. But yeah, for the most part, the two weren't the most fleshed out baddies out there. Warbucks was just a loudmouth brat who more than anything went into a tantrum whenever people or things didn't bend to her every whim, leading to her to just rely on her daddy's money to solve all of her problems. Meanwhile, Sedusa, while at least having an interesting gimmick of being a master disguise to hide her very two-faced personality, did have much of an interesting character. She was just another evil femme fatale who was more known for giving Miss Bellum her best episode. The two certainly weren't bad characters or anything, and under the right conditions, even Princess and her brightness could be actually pretty hilarious.
'Cause I can pay you a lot of money!
However, when it comes to fleshed out and interesting characters, yeah, these two have the beat.
Himiko Shirogane, upon her very brief first appearance, seemed not too different from her OG counterpart, being an attention-seeking little brat. Thus, it would have been fair to assume that once her actual debut episode came in 6, she wouldn't have been that much different. Coincidentally, this is also the episode where the show's version of the aforementioned Fuzzy debuted, and he wasn't that much different than his original. However, just through a little change of perspective, we're about to see that Himiko was a very different princess than Warbucks. First of all, she did genuinely have loved ones besides herself, like her pet cat Sapphire. And later, when she did turn into her chaotic evil princess form, it was more due to a gradual descent into madness that, to be fair, was kind of the fault of the girls. After all, on top of ignoring her in their civilian forms, their activities ended up getting her favorite soap opera preempted, which is by far the greatest crime possible. But yeah, later episodes would then further flesh out her motivations, most notably her complicated relationship with her sister, Miyako. As while she did genuinely admire her elder sibling to the point that she likely modeled a lot of her mannerisms after her, she also knew her parents did at least hold a slight degree of favoritism towards her. Hell, maybe her mimicking Miko was a bit of a cry for attention from her parents, which, yeah, ooh. As a result, Himiko was a somewhat sympathetic antagonist. I mean, she still was a rich brat, who, even if she was doing it to get to her sister's level, she was still flaunting her parents' money in order to literally buy friends. Still, over the course of the series, you could say that she does kind of develop and mellow out. Her parents did show that, while not exactly equal, they did care about their second daughter, and Miko did leave a positive impression on her sister, albeit at the cost of the girl's dignity. In turn, Himiko did end up opening up a little and listened more to others, resulting in her princess persona pretty much disappearing in the final arc of the series. A similar arc was shared with the other major villainess of the series, Sedusa, aka Sakurako Kintoki. Yeah, unlike I'm a good lady, Sakurako was exactly that. Just a meek yet hardworking owner of a traditional Japanese confection shop. Which, in order to maintain such traditions, she also forbade herself from using cosmetics of any sort, believing the scents could affect how her food tasted. This resulted in her penting up her desire to be a little more stylish, especially in front of a guy she liked named Soichiro. The Blacklights noticed this, resulting in the creation of this show's version of Fate Stay Night's Rider, albeit a much curvier version of even that lady.
Yeah, well, I usually wouldn't complain about a little fan service here and there. I do have to admit, Sedusa's over-the-top proportions did serve an important plot purpose, like an actual plot purpose.
Though in her case, it was a little more self-imposed, with the perception that her traditionalist upbringing was restraining her quote-unquote true beauty, hence why she turned into something that was both a tribute to the original, but also more in tune with Western ideals of attractiveness, or at least what a slightly out-of-touch lady who only read about fashion in magazines viewed it as. The irony, of course, being that she never really needed to pursue such, as Soichiro was already attracted to her, and there was always workarounds that would allow her to be a little more fashionable whilst wearing her traditional jinbei.
Which, let's be honest, this is peak fashion right here, brah.
But yeah, Sedusa Z really did end up representing the producer Hiro Miseki's concept of erotic cool for the show, in that she could be a very fan-servicey character, but also they make her a very fleshed out character in ways that I'll straight up say made her a far superior version than what she was based on. She was a lady who was willing to literally reshape her entire body into something very practical, all for the sake of receiving validation that she had already long since achieved, but couldn't realize it as she was distracted by the ideals and perceptions of others. And when she realized this, Sedusa, much like Princess, was absent from the final arc as their host had no need for them anymore.
These two really did end up highlighting a strong theme of the series that we'll get to in just a bit. But first, why don't we change gears a little and take a look at some of the more original villains of this show.
Well, good luck with all that.
One thing I really noticed while reviewing this show was how surprisingly topical it was at times.
Again, this show came out in 2006 when things were generally pretty calm IRL, at least compared to nowadays, where apparently everything has to include some shoot-in politics.
You've got to do better, Senator.
And yet, it ended up tackling some pretty current talking points like body positivity, online toxicity, and in turn, stan culture. All of it obviously were unintentional for the most part, and more just a result of them wanting to teach some timeless lessons. Key among them, of course, just being a good person to those around you, which, yeah, is a little low in demand, especially in the online spaces, but the fact that all of the girls got their powers from incredibly selfless acts of protecting kids from white lice that could have easily vaporized them were really effective ways of establishing them as superheroines, and something that would become a little more prevalent in the later years of Precure.
And while these girls certainly weren't goody two-shoes, to say the least, I do think that they were able to impart some of the more important messages ultimately.
The episodes that exemplified these points were 10 and the second half of 17. The former episode was what really made me start to appreciate this series, especially since we reviewed it around the time the script leaks for the CW's live-action Powerpuff surfaced. The episode was about a pretentious hairstylist named Michelle who tried to push his ridiculous haircuts as works of art, and anyone who didn't get his sensibilities were just wrong and haters. He eventually became a literal monster after being a figurative one through his rather toxic man-child attitude. But now he had brainwashing powers to convince others to buy into his ideals of beauty.
Dude, I can't think of any real-life equivalents of a toxic fruitcake with undeserved following that allows them to peddle their crappy beauty products. Nope, not at all.
No, yeah, and he was also at least coded queer, though no big deal really, just wanted to add to the parallels. Though, you know, if this character had been adapted for the CW, they probably would have made him like one of the main protagonists, because of course, identity politics have to take front and center in their shows, rather than actually competent writing. But yeah, this ended up having a great message about being cautious about what sort of trends you choose to follow, and the negative consequences, especially when those who forefront them might not exactly be of sound minds. Meanwhile, the latter half of episode 17 almost perfectly predicted the onset and folly of social media, even though Twitter was still very much in its infancy at the time of this airing. And yet, we still ended up with a story about a couple of idiots trying to flex that their pictures of food looked better than the others. As a result, the actual broadband they were using became legitimately one of the most sympathetic one-off monsters of this whole series. I mean, there were several other monsters who were also born out of the selfishness of humans, but this one definitely had one of the more relatable stories, if only because of his association with phones.
Which, let's be honest, these things kind of have become the downfall of mankind.
Regardless, the show had some pretty interesting original villains who also happened to highlight probably one of the biggest overlapping themes of the series, that being how people can come to appreciate and recognize their own place in this world.
Sure, there's nothing wrong with pursuing grander dreams, as long as you don't take it too far and end up inconveniencing those around you, but at the same time, we should never forget about the fortunes that we already have, and should consider ways we can better the world around us through them.
A good example of this was, unfortunately, the incomplete tale of Takaaki the Bubble Beast. Yeah, one of my biggest complaints of this series was the fact that they only gave this character 2 episodes to flesh out his conflict. That said, what was there was good, as it showed the struggles this chronically sick boy went through and how his desires to be able to walk again were warped into a literal monstrosity. And with Miyako's help, he was able to realize that, while likely slim, there was still a chance he'd be able to fully recover from his ailments naturally, rather than running away from his problems with legs that weren't really his. Like with Hibiko and Sakurako, they all just need to realize that there would always be something to appreciate about their lives, and that there were ways of improving them without using drastic measures like literally Faustian deals. This was of course even reflected with our main heroines. Momoko was the Powerpuff who was probably the biggest departure from her OG in that she wasn't all that book smart. Probably not a total idiot, but also less likely to want to hit the books. What she did have, possibly even more so than the original Blossom, were her street smarts. She was very skilled at problem solving and finding unique solutions to their problems. A lot of it seemed to stem from her appreciation of tokusatsu, which of course really helps in a toy animation. As a result, while not quite the upright, lawful good that was her OG, Momoko was a lot less egotistical and could be pretty down to earth. It made her an incredibly entertaining lead, who could both deliver some good morality, whilst also somehow becoming public enemy number 1 after a series of escalating lies. Yeah, it's a good thing your show is mostly episodic, because otherwise...
空ってつくんじゃなかった？
At first, Miyako also seemed like a fairly significant departure from her OG. Sure, she still had the bubbly personality with her head often in the clouds, but she was arguably the most mature of the girls. So I guess you could say the Blossom and Bubbles of the show trade each other's maturity, though I would also argue the OG could be the most mature at times, and as a result, the most versatile of the team, acting as their heart and ambassador. The same very much did still apply with Miyako, as seen through the aforementioned Takaaki arc. I would say the biggest actual difference was that she never went hardcore, nor did she let things bother her quite as much. She was a sweet kid who stood by some very traditionalist Japanese beliefs of what it means to be a proper lady that, while admittedly archaic, did lead her to becoming more responsible. And hey, at least her Bubble Boy story ended on a much happier note than Kenichi Joji's. Kaoru was arguably the closest to her OG, though surprisingly even more of a tomboy than the original Buttercup. For instance, while she did get used to it, she initially hated her costume as it incorporated a skirt, albeit with just a leotard underneath. This likely stemmed from her being the only daughter born into a big family, complete with a luchador matriarchy. Said Daddy Lucha was a significant inspiration, to the point that she did model a lot of her traits after him, for better and for worse. That said, she was still willing to try girly things, as accepting the skirt even proved, but she just did find more comfort in trousers, which there's nothing wrong with that. As ultimately, what really mattered was opening up more to others, which she did actually have a fairly significant arc for in regards to her team, and Ken, who she had become a big sister mentor for. Of the 3 girls, she arguably went through the most character development, and definitely had one of the nicest ending theme sequences, though I still like Momoko's more. In terms of the side characters, they were also handled pretty well. Miss Bellum and the Bear were unfortunately watered down, especially the former, who was mostly just there for fan service, and didn't have any awesome moments like her OG counterpart. However, the profs were pretty good. Utonium was still the lovable boomer dad like the original, and not his 2016 version, or whatever this was gonna be. And while he did kind of devolve into Mr. Exposition dump at times, he also did show an entertainingly heroic side, like when he donned his version of the Super Professor costume, or when he went full Saotome and built a Dynamo Z as a giant Getarobo reference. Stuff like that really makes you appreciate how this was made by toy animation. However, the addition of an actual child for him in Ken was a very interesting change. For whatever reason, it didn't stop Utonium from treating the girls like his daughters, but at least the boy himself was a good character. He went through a decent character arc in the early latter half of the series about opening up more to others rather than being cooped up in the lab all day, and as mentioned, it did help Kaoru to be more sociable when she found a little brother outside of her actual family. Moreover, his relationship with Peach, who was a Precure mascot in all but name, was very cute, and yeah, I really did feel when they almost had to do an Old Yeller on him in the final episode. And together, they all made for a fun supporting cast without taking anything away from the girls. And overall, I think the changes they made for what was supposed to be the quote-unquote Asian version of the original managed to do its own thing, but also pay some nice tributes to the OG. Sure, not all of it worked out for the better in any sort of way, but I do think it was a show that could stand on its own as an entertaining magical girl anime that deserves a little more attention, especially when you consider the lasting effects it likely had on what became Toei's real magical girl cash cow. As mentioned, the series came out around the time when Precure was still in its relative infancy and was still kind of finding its identity, as it was originally going to just be a one-off 26-episode series and not the franchise it is today.
Which reminds me, I eventually need to get back to that series and its unplanned original extension. Oh boy.
But yeah, it still hadn't quite reached the arguably golden era of Umezawa, and I do believe this show was an important stepping stone towards that. Most notably, I think this was reflected in the writers who started working for Toei through this show. There was Mio Inoue, who would go on to write a good chunk of Heartcatch and Tropical Rouge, and is now set to write upcoming episodes of Hirogaru. Kind of likewise, Takashi Yamada would head write Heartcatch, and while I have my issues with him, I'm certainly not going to deny Isamu Murayama's contributions to Precure that actually started here right before he started work on Yes Precure 5, and then went on to write the All-Stars Deluxe movies, and yeah, the rest is history for better and for worse. Lastly, and while this person hasn't written for Precure, maybe one day, the head writer of this show was Yoshio Urasawa. We bring him up because he had famously head written for Gekiso Sentai Car Ranger. And this is just me theorizing, but I do wonder if this show started the trend of bringing tokusatsu writers into Precure. Yeah, if you've watched some of our previous Toy Trinity videos, then you'll know that I'm a strong believer in that sharing writers between all three major toy franchises has been nothing but beneficial, especially for the magical girls. The aforementioned Umezawa era started with Fresh Precure, which was written by Atsushi Maekawa, who also had one of the more well-received Sentai of that time, Magi Ranger. A few years after that, we got Smile Precure, the series that was so successful that Saban Brands tried to create another Power Rangers and failed miserably, rip. But yeah, it was written by Shoji Yonemura, who has written some of the more polarizing Kamen Rider screenplays, to say the least, but had also written several great scripts for Precure beforehand, and obviously Smile went down well. And all in all, this was objectively the most financially successful era of Precure, and I honestly like to think it was because this version of the Powerpuff Girls walked so that they could run.
And again, I'm not gonna pretend like this is the best anime ever, and much less the greatest magical girl show ever.
The animation, outside of a few home run episodes, was overall below average even for the time. Some of the characters were irredeemably annoying or criminally underused. And yet, having reviewed and really analyzed it, I think this is one of the most fun shows we've ever covered for this channel. Again, it doesn't try to overcomplicate its message and themes, and yet I'd say some of this stuff is even more relevant today. It just kind of illustrates how you don't always need the best production values or even the strongest plots, you just need at least a fun and enjoyable cast to get invested in, which in many ways was the goal of the original series. Whatever flavor of Powerpuff you choose, they both are shows where you can just appreciate the girls who whoop ass. Hey, I'm just quoting Craig McCracken's original title. But yeah, as its own entity, I think this anime is more than worth a watch, and as a possible stepping stone for Precure's greater success, I think it deserves a lot more appreciation. Their show might have ended a while ago, but the spirits of these girls continue to protect this world even into today.
Thanks for watching, and do look forward to more overviews that we'll do for other series, like that one that we do eventually need to get back to. But before that, we'll just take one last detour to look at a certain Precure doujinshi, which, oh boy, it's gonna be different. But until then though, farewell for now my friends, and oh no, it's already starting.